Before we begin, if you enjoy stories about saints, miracles, and extraordinary lives that changed history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Saints and Miracles, and share this story with someone who loves history and inspiring true events. And when you're done, don't forget to explore our other documentaries. Every story on this channel is connected by one thing: ordinary people whose lives became anything but ordinary. Nobody expected a former slave to transform Ireland forever. In fact, when he was just a boy, nobody expected him to survive what was coming. And what happened next changed everything. Most people know St. Patrick as the patron saint of Ireland. They know about St. Patrick's Day. They know about shamrocks, parades, and legends. But very few people know the incredible story behind the man himself. Because Patrick was not born in Ireland, he was not born a saint, and he certainly did not begin his life as a hero. He began as a spoiled young boy who wanted nothing more than to enjoy life. And here is where things get interesting. Long before churches were built across Ireland, long before millions of people celebrated his name, Patrick lived in Roman Britain during the final years of the Roman Empire. His family was respected. His father, Calpurnius, was both a local official and a deacon in the church. Patrick grew up surrounded by comfort and privilege. He had food on the table, servants in the household, and opportunities that most people could only dream about. But Patrick had little interest in faith. To him, religion was something adults talked about. Something boring, something that kept him from having fun. His father often worried about him. Patrick loved adventure, excitement, and mischief far more than discipline. One day, after another argument, his father became frustrated. He had watched his son ignore his tutors, disobey instructions, and waste his time. He warned Patrick that life was bigger than himself, that one day he would understand. But Patrick could not see it. Like many young people, he believed he had all the time in the world. He dreamed of freedom. He dreamed of making his own decisions. He dreamed of a future where nobody could tell him what to do. Little did he know that his life was about to change forever. Because far away, across the sea, danger was already approaching. Irish raiders had become feared throughout the region. These men attacked villages without warning. They stole livestock, they burned homes, and worst of all, they captured people. Strong young men and boys were especially valuable. They were sold as slaves, and on one terrible night, Patrick's peaceful world collapsed. Without warning, screams filled the air. Dogs barked, people ran, chaos erupted everywhere, pirates had arrived. Patrick's father desperately tried to protect his family. His mother cried out in fear. Everyone was running. And in the confusion, Patrick heard his father's final command: "Run! Run, Patrick! Run!" Terrified, the young boy ran as fast as he could, but it was useless. The raiders were everywhere. Hands grabbed him. He struggled. He screamed, but no one could save him. Within moments, everything he had ever known disappeared. His home, his family, his freedom, gone. And just like that, the privileged son of a Roman official became a prisoner. Patrick could hardly believe what was happening. Surely this had to be a mistake. Surely someone would recognize who he was. Surely his father would pay whatever ransom they demanded. After all, he was the son of an important man. He did not belong among prisoners. But wait, there is more. The men who captured him did not care who his father was. To them, Patrick was no different from anyone else. He was cargo, nothing more. And soon, after a terrifying journey across the sea, the young boy arrived in a strange land, Ireland. But this island was very different from the country we know today. It was a land divided by clans, a land ruled by tribal chiefs, a land where pagan priests known as druids held great influence. A land filled with fear, superstition, and endless conflicts. And for Patrick, it would become the land of his captivity. He desperately pleaded with his captors. He told them about his father, he promised them wealth, he begged them to release him. But nobody listened. One of the leaders laughed. "Whatever you were before, you are now a slave, and don't you ever forget it." Those words shattered him, because suddenly Patrick understood. Nobody was coming. No rescue, no ransom, no escape. He was 16 years old, and his old life was over. He had lost everything. Or so he thought. Because sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as tragedy. However, nobody expected what would happen next. The young man who once complained about everything would soon face loneliness, cold, hunger, fear, and suffering unlike anything he had ever imagined. And it would be in the middle of that darkness that he would discover something far greater than freedom itself, something that would eventually lead him back to the very people who had enslaved him. And one day, against all odds, the former slave nobody believed in would change Ireland forever. But that part of the story was still far away, because first Patrick had to survive. And what awaited him in the mountains of Ireland would test him in ways he could never have imagined. So stay with us, because here is where the story becomes truly remarkable. And if you're enjoying this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Saints and Miracles, and explore our other stories about extraordinary lives and miracles that shaped history. The mountains of Ireland were beautiful, but to Patrick, they felt like a prison. Far from his family, far from his home, and far from everything he had once loved, the 16-year-old boy who had grown up surrounded by comfort suddenly found himself alone in a strange and unforgiving land. Every morning, he woke up not as the son of a respected Roman official, but as property, a slave. And the hardest part was knowing that nobody was coming to rescue him. At first, Patrick refused to accept his new reality. He constantly thought about escaping. He dreamed about his parents. He replayed the terrible night of his capture over and over in his mind. Why had this happened? Why had God allowed it? Why him? These questions haunted him day and night. And here is where things get interesting. Patrick had been raised in a Christian family. His father was a deacon. His grandfather had served as a priest. But despite growing up around faith, Patrick himself had never truly known God. Religion had simply been something his parents practiced. He had never made it his own. Now, with no friends and no family around him, Patrick faced a loneliness unlike anything he had ever experienced. His master assigned him to watch sheep in the cold hills and valleys, day after day, month after month, year after year. The work was exhausting. Rain, snow, wind, isolation. He spent countless nights sleeping outside, sometimes hungry, sometimes sick, always tired. And yet, something unexpected was beginning to happen. For the first time in his life, Patrick started talking to God. Not with fancy prayers, not with memorized words, just simple conversations, small prayers, honest prayers. Help me. Protect me. Give me strength. Please don't leave me alone. At first, those prayers felt strange, but gradually something inside him began to change. The spoiled boy who once cared only about himself slowly disappeared, and a different man began to emerge. A man shaped by suffering. A man transformed by faith. What happened next changed everything. Patrick later wrote that during those years he prayed constantly, sometimes hundreds of times a day. He prayed while watching the sheep. He prayed while walking through the mountains. He prayed before sleeping. He prayed when he woke up. And somehow, in the middle of his suffering, he discovered something he had never experienced before. Peace, not because life had become easier, it hadn't. He was still a slave, still alone, still separated from everyone he loved. But now he no longer felt abandoned. He felt that God was with him, before him, behind him, beside him, above him, and within him. Years later, Patrick would remember those lonely days not as the worst years of his life, but as the years when he truly found God. But wait, there is more. While Patrick's faith was growing stronger, the world around him remained harsh. Ireland at that time was divided into clans ruled by chieftains. The druids held tremendous power. People worshipped many gods. Gods of war, gods of storms, gods of trees, gods of rocks. Fear controlled much of daily life. Sacrifices were common. Superstitions shaped decisions, and mercy was often seen as weakness. Patrick's master, a local chieftain named Sessanen, lived according to these ancient customs. Like many leaders of the time, he relied heavily on the advice of the druids. Among them was a powerful priest named Cathbad. Cathbad claimed to speak for the gods. People feared him. Nobody dared question him. But not everyone was satisfied, because despite all the sacrifices and rituals, suffering still existed. Children became sick, crops failed, families struggled, and one problem in particular brought great sorrow to Sessanen's household. His young son was weak and frail. For years, the family had prayed to their gods. For years, they had offered sacrifices. For years, they had listened to Cathbad, but nothing changed, and little by little, doubt began to grow. Could the gods really hear them? Could they truly help? Nobody knew. Meanwhile, Patrick continued tending the sheep, and surprisingly, he became very good at it. Despite difficult seasons and failed harvests, the sheep under his care thrived. People noticed. Milk was plentiful, cheese was abundant. The animals remained healthy. Many wondered how this slave had become so successful. Patrick always gave the same answer: "It is because God helps me." Some people laughed, others were curious, but nobody expected what would happen next. One day, Patrick found himself standing before Lord Sisenen. For 6 years, he had served faithfully, 6 long years. And now the chieftain wanted answers. Sisenen had heard Patrick speak about his God. A God unlike the many gods worshipped throughout Ireland. A God who knew suffering. A God who listened. A God who cared. The old chieftain looked at the young slave and asked him a question born out of years of disappointment. "Would your God hear a prayer for my son?" The room fell silent. For years the druids had failed. For years sacrifices had produced nothing. Could the God of this foreign slave do what their gods could not? And this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. Patrick was no priest. He was no bishop. He had received no great education. He was simply a shepherd, a slave, a young man who had discovered faith in the middle of suffering. But perhaps that was exactly why he understood something others had missed. He believed that God cared about the weak, that he listened to prayers, that he was merciful. And for the first time in years, hope entered the heart of Lord Sisenen. But not everyone was pleased. Because while hope was beginning to grow in one man's heart, jealousy and anger were growing in another. And the powerful druid Cathbad was watching everything. He had spent his life speaking for the gods. He had spent years maintaining his authority, and he was not about to allow a young Christian slave to challenge everything he stood for. However, nobody expected how far Cathbad was willing to go, because very soon, Patrick would find himself facing death, and what happened next would change not only his life, but eventually the destiny of an entire nation. Here is where things become even more interesting. Patrick had spent 6 long years in slavery, 6 years of cold nights, 6 years of loneliness, 6 years of talking to God in the hills of Ireland. And although his chains were invisible, something inside him had changed. The boy who had once thought only of himself had become a man of compassion, patience, and faith. But while Patrick's heart had changed, danger was quietly growing around him, because the druid Cathbad had begun to see the young Christian slave as a threat. And here is where things get interesting. For years, Cathbad had been the spiritual authority among the clans. People feared him. People obeyed him. When sickness came, they sought his advice. When crops failed, they offered sacrifices according to his instructions. His power rested on fear. But now, something was changing. Lord Sisenen, Patrick's master, had begun asking questions. Questions that made Cathbad uncomfortable. Questions that challenged everything he believed. Most painful of all, his own people had started listening to a slave, a foreigner, a Christian, and Cathbad hated it. Then one day, Lord Sisenen brought Patrick into his home. His young son had been sick for years. Nothing had worked. The sacrifices, the prayers, the rituals, nothing. Years of pleading with the gods had brought only disappointment. And now, with little hope left, the chieftain looked at Patrick. "Would your God hear your prayer for my son?" The room became silent. Even Patrick was surprised. He was not a priest. He was not a bishop. He had no special training. He was only a shepherd. But he had learned something during his years in suffering. God listens. Patrick knelt beside the boy, and with simple words, he prayed. Not with complicated rituals, not with fear, not with sacrifices, just with faith. God in heaven, through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, I ask you to heal this child. But before another word could be spoken, Cathbad exploded in anger. "Out!" His voice echoed through the house. "How dare you bring your God into this place?" The old druid was furious. He could feel his influence slipping away. And what happened next changed everything. Lord Sessanan was no longer afraid. For years he had obeyed the druids. For years he had offered sacrifices. For years he had watched his son suffer. Enough was enough. For the first time, he openly challenged Cathbad. And that terrified the old priest, because people who begin asking questions are dangerous to those who rule through fear. But wait, there is more. Cathbad was not about to surrender his authority, not without a fight. In secret, he began plotting. This Christian had to die, before his strange faith spread any further, before others began listening, before the gods themselves became angry, and so a terrible plan was made. At the next full moon, Patrick would be sacrificed. The gods demanded blood, and according to Cathbad, the foreign slave would finally give it. Meanwhile, Patrick knew nothing. He continued watching the sheep, continued praying, continued trusting God. He had no idea that death was approaching, but God had other plans, and this next part surprised even historians. One night, as Patrick slept, he had a dream. It felt so real that years later he would write about it. In the dream, he heard a voice. "The ship is ready." At first, he did not understand. What ship? Where? But the message became clear. God was calling him to leave. His time in Ireland had come to an end. Patrick woke up immediately. His heart was racing. Could it be true? After 6 years, could freedom finally be possible? However, nobody expected what would happen next. Patrick decided to trust the dream. Without hesitation, he escaped. If he were caught, he would almost certainly be killed. Yet he ran. Through forests, through mountains, across rough terrain. Days passed. Hunger followed him. Exhaustion nearly overcame him, but still he pressed on. And finally, after an incredible journey, he reached the coast. There, before his eyes, stood a ship. Exactly as he had seen in his dream. Patrick could hardly believe it. Tears filled his eyes. For 6 years he had prayed. For 6 years he had suffered. And now, standing before the sea, he saw what seemed impossible. Freedom. But here is where things become truly remarkable. Getting to the ship did not guarantee safety. The sailors were suspicious. Why should they trust a poor runaway slave? Patrick had no money, no possessions, nothing. And at first, they refused to take him. Imagine the despair. After surviving so much, after escaping certain death, after seeing the ship exactly as God had shown him, now everything seemed lost. But Patrick prayed again, and somehow the hearts of the sailors changed. They allowed him aboard, and just like that, the former slave began his journey home. After 6 years of captivity, Patrick was finally free. But freedom was not the end of his story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Because back in Britain, his family had almost given up hope. His parents believed they would never see him again. They had mourned him, prayed for him, cried for him. And now, after years of suffering, the impossible happened. Patrick returned home. His mother embraced him with tears. His father could hardly believe his eyes. The boy who had left was gone. Standing before them was a different man. A man shaped by suffering. A man transformed by faith. His father remembered something he had once told his son. One day you will understand that life is bigger than yourself. And now Patrick finally understood. But wait, there is more. Most people would have been satisfied. Home, safety, family, comfort. Everything Patrick had dreamed about during those 6 terrible years. But something strange began happening. He could not forget Ireland. He could not forget the people. He could not forget the land of his captivity, the mountains, the sheep, the faces, even Lord Sessanan. And the more he prayed, the stronger one feeling became. God had not saved him merely to give him his old life back. God had something else planned, something bigger, something nobody could have imagined. Years passed. Patrick studied. He devoted himself to God. He learned the scriptures. Eventually, he became a priest, and later a bishop. His life was comfortable again. His suffering was behind him, or so everyone thought. Because one night, many years after escaping slavery, Patrick had another dream. And this dream would change the course of history. He saw a man calling to him. His voice seemed to come from Ireland itself. "Patrick, come back, holy boy. We have need of you." Patrick awoke in shock. Return to Ireland? The place that had stolen his youth, the land of his suffering, the people who had enslaved him? Surely not. Surely God would ask anything except that. But what happened next would astonish the world, because the former slave was about to do something almost impossible. He was preparing to return, not in chains, not in anger, not seeking revenge, but willingly, and his decision would transform Ireland forever. Patrick could have stayed in Britain, no one would have blamed him. After everything he had endured, he had earned a peaceful life. He had escaped slavery. He had reunited with his family. He had devoted himself to God. And now, after years of study and preparation, he had become a bishop. Most people expected him to spend the rest of his life among his own people. But God had something else in mind. And here is where things get interesting. The memories of Ireland never left him. Neither did the dream. Again and again, Patrick remembered the voices calling him. "We ask you, holy servant, to come and walk among us once more." Those words haunted him. Return. Return to the very land where he had suffered. Return to the people who had stolen his freedom. Many thought the idea was madness. His friends warned him. His family feared losing him again. Some church leaders doubted him. Ireland was dangerous. The druids held power. The tribes constantly fought one another. Christianity had almost no presence there. And yet Patrick could not ignore what he believed God was asking him to do. What happened next changed everything. With only a small group of companions, Patrick crossed the sea and returned to Ireland, not as a slave, not as a prisoner, but as a missionary. And perhaps the most remarkable part of all was this: he returned without hatred, without revenge, without bitterness. He came back with forgiveness. But wait, there is more. The island Patrick returned to was unlike anything in the Roman world. Pagan rituals dominated society. The druids advised kings and chiefs. Sacred fires burned in honor of ancient gods. Fear and superstition guided many decisions. And the High King himself ruled from Tara, the political and spiritual center of the island. No one expected a foreign bishop and a handful of followers to change anything, and certainly not the druids. Many of them laughed, others saw Patrick as a threat. And among them, one man stood above all the others: Cathbad. Years earlier, the old druid had watched Patrick escape. Now, hearing that the former slave had returned, his hatred burned stronger than ever. He was determined to stop him once and for all, and this next part surprised even historians. Every year, before anyone in Ireland was allowed to light a fire, the High King's ceremonial fire was lit at Tara. It was one of the most sacred traditions in the land. No one dared challenge it. But Patrick made a shocking decision. Before the High King's fire was lit, Patrick and his companions lit their own paschal fire. A Christian fire, a symbol of Christ. The act stunned everyone. It was considered an open challenge. The druids were furious. Cathbad was enraged. The High King himself demanded to know who had dared break such an ancient custom. Soldiers were sent, and many expected Patrick's death. However, nobody expected what would happen next. When Patrick stood before the king, he did not tremble. He did not insult anyone. He did not threaten anyone. Instead, he spoke with courage and calm. He explained the Christian faith. He spoke about forgiveness. He spoke about love. He spoke about a God who had come into the world not to destroy sinners, but to save them. Some mocked him, others laughed. But something strange happened. The king did not order his execution. In fact, he allowed Patrick to continue preaching. And this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. One by one, people began listening, not because Patrick forced them, not because he commanded armies, not because he possessed wealth, but because his life spoke louder than his words. He had every reason to hate Ireland. Yet he had returned. He had every reason to seek revenge. Yet he offered forgiveness. People could not understand it, and little by little, hearts began to change. Chiefs converted. Families embraced Christianity, communities abandoned old practices, churches appeared, monasteries were established, and the message spread farther and farther, but not everyone accepted it. Cathbad and many druids fought fiercely against Patrick. They accused him, they threatened him, they tried to turn the kings against him. More than once, Patrick's life was in danger. But he refused to leave. And what happened next changed Ireland forever. Among those who encountered Patrick was a young boy named Benignus. Their meeting would become one of the most important moments in Irish history. According to tradition, the child was deeply moved by Patrick's kindness and wisdom. He became one of Patrick's closest followers. Years later, Benignus himself would become one of the great leaders of the Irish Church. But he was only one of many. Generation after generation, new leaders emerged. Monasteries became centers of learning. Schools flourished. Missionaries carried the faith throughout the island. And eventually, something extraordinary happened. The island, once known for tribal conflicts and pagan traditions, became one of the great centers of Christianity in Europe. Scholars copied ancient manuscripts. Monks preserved knowledge. Missionaries from Ireland would one day bring Christianity back to parts of Europe devastated after the fall of the Roman Empire. And here is where things become even more interesting. The very nation that had once enslaved Patrick became one of the nations that helped preserve Christian civilization. Something nobody could have imagined when a terrified 16-year-old boy was dragged onto a slave ship. But the greatest surprise of all was still to come, because over the centuries, stories about Patrick spread across the world. Some were true, some became legends, and one particular story would make his name known to millions of people who knew almost nothing about the man himself. A story involving snakes. And the truth behind that legend is far more fascinating than most people realize. And what it reveals about Patrick's real legacy may surprise you. As Patrick grew older, his influence spread across Ireland in ways that few could have imagined. The man who had once arrived on the island in chains was now welcomed by kings, chiefs, and ordinary people seeking hope. Churches were established. Monasteries began to flourish. Entire communities embraced Christianity. And little by little, Ireland itself was changing. But wait, there is more. Although Patrick's mission transformed a nation, legends also began to surround his name. And perhaps none became more famous than the story of the snakes. For centuries, people have repeated the story that St. Patrick drove all the snakes. For centuries, people have repeated the story that St. Patrick drove all the snakes out of Ireland. Paintings were created, stories were told, generations grew up believing it. But here is where things get interesting. Modern historians and scientists agree that Ireland likely never had snakes after the last ice age. In other words, Patrick probably never chased literal snakes from the island. So why did the story become so famous? Because many scholars believed the snakes represented something much bigger. They symbolized paganism, fear, superstition, and the old spiritual practices that had dominated Ireland for centuries. And this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. Patrick never conquered Ireland with armies. He never became a king. He never possessed riches. He never forced anyone to believe. Instead, he changed hearts. He fought darkness with hope. He answered hatred with forgiveness. He returned to the people who had enslaved him and brought them compassion instead of revenge. And what happened next changed everything. Generation after generation, Ireland became one of the great centers of Christian learning. Monks carefully copied manuscripts. Schools flourished. Missionaries left Irish shores and traveled throughout Europe, bringing knowledge and faith to lands devastated after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Historians often speak about kings and conquerors. But Patrick accomplished something many conquerors never could. He transformed a nation without raising a sword. And perhaps that is why, more than 15 centuries later, the world still remembers his name. But the most incredible part of all is this. When Patrick was captured at 16 years old, nobody expected him to survive. Nobody expected a frightened boy to endure 6 years of slavery. Nobody expected him to return home. And certainly nobody expected him to willingly return to the land of his captors. Yet that is exactly what he did. The greatest revelation promised by our story was not that Patrick escaped slavery. It was not even that he became a bishop. It was that a former slave chose forgiveness over revenge. And through that forgiveness, Ireland was transformed forever. This next part surprised even historians. Near the end of his life, Patrick wrote words that revealed the heart of the man he had become. He gave glory not to himself, but to God. He never described himself as powerful or extraordinary. Instead, he often spoke of his weaknesses and how God's grace had guided him through suffering, fear, loneliness, and impossible circumstances. In many ways, Patrick understood something that people still struggle to understand today. Sometimes our greatest wounds become the place where God builds our greatest purpose. Sometimes the chapters we would gladly erase become the chapters that change everything. And perhaps that is why the story of St. Patrick continues to inspire millions of people around the world, because it reminds us that no pain is wasted, no suffering is meaningless, no life is beyond redemption, and no past is too broken for God to use. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Saints and Miracles, and share this documentary with friends and family. Your support helps more people discover these extraordinary stories that time never forgot. And don't stop here. Explore our other documentaries here on Saints and Miracles, where you'll discover incredible stories of saints, miracles, martyrs, and remarkable people whose lives changed history. Also, if you would like to support our mission, consider making a donation to the channel. Producing these documentaries requires many hours of research, writing, and dedication. Your generosity helps keep these stories alive and may also support humanitarian and charitable initiatives inspired by the mission of the Church. Thank you for being part of Saints and Miracles. Because here, history meets faith, and behind every saint lies a story more extraordinary than most people could ever imagine. Until next time, remember our message: extraordinary lives, eternal legacy.